Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are going to have a conversation about the relationship between the CIO and the CFO. I've got a brilliant panel for this, so I'm just going to introduce everyone briefly. On my left here is Sanjay Patel, who is the former group CIO at Tate & Lyle. Next to him is Brandon Till, who is the head of transformation at Soldo. Vicky Higgin, the Chief Digital and Information Officer at City Fibre, Mark Settle, the former CIO at Okta, and Helen Ashton, who is an NED at JD Sports and previously has been the CFO at ASOS, Lloyds Retail Bank, and many other brilliant places. So we will have time for some questions, so get some difficult ones ready for this panel because they can definitely handle that. Let's just kick it off here. Let me put a question to you about the historical relationship between the CIO and the CFO. I don't know if any of you have been in CFO roles. I know Helen is brilliantly placed to talk from that perspective, but from all your experiences, what has that relationship been like historically? Can we talk a little bit about the things that have been good about it and not so good about it? And anyone feel free to kick it off. Be very spontaneous in this panel. You don't need to wait to be asked.
So let me start. I'll give you some context to my answer. Prior to the CIO role that I've just been in, I've been in transformation roles. And the context for that is in the transformation role, typically, I would work with the CEO, the CFO, and the Chief People Officer. So there was always that triad of people I would try and get together for the transformation. And the reason I share that is more often than not, we would talk about the CIO. And the topic was usually around cost and capability and credibility. And not necessarily about the individual. So the cost was always a cost because typically, and I worked in the manufacturing industry for 30 years, when you look at the P&L, the largest cost tends to be around the global operations, the supply chain, the cost of goods. And then when you look at the SG&A elements, IT usually stands out very proudly. By the way, finance does as well, but because the CFO's in the room, then IT is the one that we tend to talk about. And the cost of IT, metrics-wise, is always difficult. Is it percentage of revenue? What value are they adding? What are those people doing? How well did that project go? Which is where the credibility comes in. So my history has been around typically transformations, business operating model change, what gets done locally, regionally, globally, how do you shared service center that, how is technology enabling that, what's driving productivity has tended to be a relatively negative conversation. Having then jumped into the CIO role, I've had 4 CFOs in 5 years. And so with that background, changing the relationship has been on my agenda, which is how do I shift the conversation from yes, there is a cost element to IT, but what's the value it's bringing? And so for the first CFO, the conversation was all about, if I look back at the last 5 years and the investments we've made in IT, which is not insignificant, what value have we got from there? And therefore, part of what I've been hearing most of today is really around focusing that conversation around business value. And when we've had that conversation, it hasn't become well, the cost is too high, the credibility is not there, capability is not there. It's become a joint conversation because then jointly the CFO and the CIO at the exec level, at the board level, can have a very different conversation about mitigating risk for cyber, for example, or generative AI, managing the assets on behalf of the organization, getting a better return on the assets that we've got in the factories, helping to improve the finance function productivity, getting more insights from data. It's become a very different conversation, but that's because we shifted the relationship in terms of credibility, the individual, and therefore what the business value is.
Yeah, and I think that theme about business value has come up in many conversations today. Vicky, what are your thoughts on that relationship?
As with Sanjay, actually, the relationships I've had with CFOs has always been very positive when you can demonstrate the business value. So the conversation starts with, especially in times of hardship, how much can you cut from your budget, your OPEX and your CAPEX? And always then being able to turn that conversation round to, well, actually, let's not look at my budget yet. Let's look at what I can do to enable cost savings, efficiencies, or revenue in the rest of the business. Then let's go back and have a look at a conversation from a IT budget perspective. And generally, that's held me in really good stead.
Yeah.
Because if you can demonstrate the business value, either through EBITDA, positivity or revenue growth, then you start to have a different relationship. And I think in the past, the CIO traditionally reported into the CFO when it was a back office email kind of situation. Now where CIOs are at the forefront of the business, and IT is the business. Actually, in my business, it's not IT and the business. You can demonstrate a very different kind of relationship at a exec level.
Okay, Mark, Brandon, before I come to you, let's hear a view from the other side. Helen, what's your relationship been typically with the CIO function in and amidst all of your CFO roles?
I think it depends on the type of business that you're in. It depends what you want from technology. Definitely, sort of probably the first 20 years of my career, the tech team usually were part of finance, and it was very much, the back office systems, or if I needed a new finance system, they'd start to implement SAP, and then it would go badly wrong, and we'd rename it and start again, and go again, and then we'd all forget it and move back to what we were doing before. And that was kind of and I think in the last 10 years or so, I just think that technology has rebranded itself much more as an enabler within the business, and therefore I think that opens up so many more opportunities, because it's not just a cost, it's it's a generator of value, and therefore I just think that gives such a much bigger seat at the table. And then it's about balancing, well, how much do you need to spend on tech debt versus the front end digital experience or data, and how do you balance that with cyber? And I think thinking about the risks within the business, and therefore how do you want to manage those through. So yeah, I think the role of the the CTO has really massively changed. And now, as thinking about the more senior people in organizations, the CTO is often right up there now with the CFO in the way it wasn't before. It was definitely a sub-function.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even dream now of pretending that I could even, have technology as part of my world, because I wouldn't have enough knowledge to be able to do that.
That's interesting. Brandon,
I think it's interesting because I saw it a little bit, maybe the other side of the coin, where I saw in relation to the conversation that was before around the changing role of the CFO, I saw the CFO office changing to be more in line with the CIO now, where I think historically there was the CIO looking for innovation for the business and how do we drive productivity and innovation and new technology, where the historic view of the CFO was controlling costs and compliance. And now that role has changed so dramatically for the CFO, I find it much more in line with also thinking productivity. Much like you were saying, how do we get together on the same page and look at the business value of this? And how do we drive overall value for the company and productivity all around? So because for me, I saw it more as the role of the CFO changing than the CIO.
I've seen a change on both. Definitely 10 years ago, the CTOs I would have been speaking to would have been people who sat in the corner, didn't really speak to too many people, looked battered and had a list of 1,000 things to do and just couldn't get through them. So then they couldn't deliver, and then they lost credibility, and it was all like, and that, you don't tend to see that now. If you're looking to hire a CTO, you are looking for somebody with a lot more, storytelling, personal, that broader scope. So in that way, I think it is more like the CFO role. So I think both of those roles have moved from more specialist into broader. What I would say is, it's easier for somebody with a tech and data background to be a CFO than a CFO to be tech and data.
And it's interesting you say that, because in our last panel we had a question from someone in the audience who was on the CIO, CDIO side, who wanted to be a CFO, and Helen's advice is absolutely you can move into that role just in the right kind of business. Mark, what are your thoughts on this? How's your relationship been historically with CFOs?
There's some irony in all this. I think historically we've all commented that the two roles are sort of set up to be adversarial in everybody's mind. And I think if a CIO gets a job with a new company, if all of her friends want to know, like, are you reporting to the CEO, or are you reporting to the CFO? And one of the things that I kind of find personally comical is in in many cases, you've succeeded to report to the CEO, but the real holder of the purse strings is the CFO. And even the CEO can dream grand dreams, say, oh, I think this would be great, but why don't you go talk to Carol, the CFO, and see what she thinks, right? So all you got out of the relationship with the CEO is a permit or license to go in and have one meeting with the CFO to see if this thing has any legs whatsoever. So the other benefit about reporting to a CFO is, again, they have the power and authority to make things happen in the company. If you are trying to introduce new technology or some form of innovation or whatever, you can be like St. John the Baptist wandering in the desert, but if the CFO is over your shoulder and you have a common agenda, that's really what it comes down to at the end of the day, right?
It does, yeah. I think it
And
is absolutely the common agenda.
Now, if the CFO is not a strategic thinker and can only talk about balancing the budget or getting through the variances of the quarter, then the battle's lost.
Absolutely. If I think back to my ASOS times, Cliff, who was the CTO, I was probably closer to him than any of the other C-suite executives, because so much of what we were trying to do to build the business for the future and just keep the business safe was technology. So yeah, and hand in hand around signing off, the spend was massive there. It was a good couple of $100 million a year just in CapEx. So, you had to work like that. I think it does depend on the business.
And actually, I want to pick up on that. So you have to work very closely together. But from all of you here, what has been your best experience of working with a CFO, or for you working with a CIO, CTO? What has worked really well when it's worked? What's the secret sauce in that relationship?
From my experience at my previous role, it was around building up the technology function. So I came into a function that was probably undervalued and had a lot to, there was just so much we could do transformationally. So it was that sitting down with the CFO and kind of talking through my vision, my thoughts, what we could do, what we couldn't do, and just kind of building that business case together, actually. And she was a massive supporter of mine at the exec table and also at the board and audit committees and things like that. We had such a great relationship. She would always give me the heads up on things. There was never a time when I felt like, she was trying to catch me out or anything like that. It was a really good, tight relationship where we got investment committees to go to around specific things. If there was a bone of contention, we would have that conversation outside of the investment committees or the exec committees. And she was just a really good kind of friend
advocate
to IT, and in turn we did some great things for the finance function and the HR function and things like that from a corporate services perspective, because the corporate services are always the ones that don't get invested in and deprioritized. So we would look for other ways to kind of give them what they needed. It was just a really great kind of she was a great friend actually to IT, because she wanted to see the technology function succeed. For me it was just really good in terms of helping me navigate the organisation and get what we needed really for the company.
If I build on that and go to I've probably worked with a dozen CFOs in my time. It's exactly
four of them in that one.
Four of them in one role.
That one period, yeah.
And the others in partnership with the CEO and the CHRO. But it's the point that I think you're making, which is having a relationship with them. And part of having a relationship with them is to take away some of those credibility point that you made earlier on, right? Which is, what are you going to do to build credibility in the function if you're running the IT function? The capability, right? But also the joint agenda. So the best relationship I've had is where you are really clear at a personal level what good looks like. And so some of the best relationships have been coaching both ways, because you have a lens across all of the other functions. We talk about finance, and they have a lens across technology that gets talked about when they're not in the room, and actually having an open conversation about what will make both of you successful. And then I guess the other piece is that, what's the common goal for the business outcome? And where that's worked really well is where you've been able to do that despite the obstacles that are in place, whether that's an organizational obstacle, whether that's a people obstacle, whether that's a cultural obstacle. And that, I think, to pick on your point, Vicky, the best success stories have been where in a relatively short period of time, you've both achieved something that was relevant. So in my case, whether it was a global cost reduction program, which was the first thing that CFO came in to do, whether it was actually to make the transformation happen, which is what that particular CFO came in to do, whether it was investing in a carve-out, which was a $2 billion deal, which is what that CFO came in to do, or whether it was being personal with the last CFO and actually providing them with a briefing of what had been happened, because they'd never had a briefing. They'd walked into the job. No one had actually given them the history of what was going on. And they kept bumping into all of these historical comments. And I'd actually spent the time to say, actually, what I'm going to do is not talk about me and my technology function, but I'm actually going to talk about what's been happening in this company that you're walking into. And she really appreciated that, because no one was actually going to give them that. And similarly, some really simple personal feedback sessions. That first video you made, you might want to think about doing that slightly different, quite personal, but no one else was going to say that. So building that sort of personal relationship, I think, has been, for me, you want the secret sauce in terms of actually making that happen.
Yeah. Brandon?
Yeah, for me, I think about it as there's a chance to learn, and I think it's about making sure you're speaking the same language. And maybe this is where the poor battered CTO comes in, looking discouraged when you have one person speaking a language of features and how this is going to improve the business in one way, and the other roles looking at what's this going to cost, or what's the real value this is going to bring in, and to not be on the same page with what you're asking. So I was lucky early in my career. I don't even remember what I was pitching, but it's a big deck I've put together, put a lot of work into it, sitting down with the CFO to say, this is going to change the business. This is exactly what we need. And she took it and she said, okay, let me tell you how to ask for things. And it was what's the ask, what's the strategy, what's the details. And it's something I've been able to take with me to make it very clear, what are we asking for? What's the strategy? And how does this fit into the business goals? And then what's the details, including what's the impact this is going to make?
So what happened to that pitch book?
Yeah, I don't even think I ever fully got to present it. I think maybe once I put it down in that framework, I'm not sure it was as impactful as I thought. Yeah. But it is that it's come up that it shouldn't be the most persuasive or the loudest voice to come in. But do people know how to ask from IT to the CFO, or from any department coming into a CFO? How do we ask to make these changes, and how do we prove value? It's really important to prove this is business.
Well, and someone has to show you, how do you make that ask, as exactly what happened to you. Do you find that, Helen, when they're making an ask and you think this is all wrong, this isn't how you should be going about it?
Yeah.
Go on, spill some juice. Give us some examples.
Well, it's ultimately, you've got to step back and try and put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's sitting there. And, as CFOs, we are looking at what the return on investment is looking like. But we don't know that much about technology. We know enough to be dangerous usually. But, it's no good coming in with all of this detail of why, because you look at it and you go, and I think the communication and the relationships are really important, but the communication and that simplicity and that sitting down with the CFO, particularly a new CFO, and saying, what's going to work for you? How do we do this? Can we come up with a standard way? And I mean, certainly for me, I tend to be a plan on a page, something on one page. And remember, if I have to take it to a board, they know even less than I know. So how do we put it into that really simple layman's language that ultimately is, that trade-off of value and cost? But work with us together to work that through, because it isn't simple. But working together, you can get into that habit. And then once you've got into a bit of a rhythm, it's fine. But I think it's always been a two-way street for me with the CTO. And I've got to say, the CTO that I worked with at ASOS, I learned more from him around transitioning a business to an agile, sprint, product-focused digital world than anybody. And he drove in that business that shift from a much more hierarchical, traditional business to a much more agile business.
And why was it that you learned so much from him?
Because unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, but finance people are structured individuals, right? We do things in very process ways. And this idea of agility You don't naturally think of finance people being agile because you'd think of that as being quite risky, actually. We want it to be like 90% right before we sign it off. And I think, finance has to learn to be agile in the same way technology does. And I think that he managed to create a culture in that business that was very different and drove agility, whatever you call them, the hot houses where they all went off and with a problem and sorted stuff and created this mentality that people could create change themselves. And I thought that was amazing. So, you come and we hold the purse strings, but don't underestimate the power of what you do and the learnings that come with that. And how then do you take that into finance teams? And actually, if you can work like that, why are finance teams not working in a sprint type of mentality as well? I think there's huge amounts to learn working together.
Couldn't it be on finance to be more proactive in building that culture of agility, or that enabling the other teams to act in that agile way?
Absolutely. But remember that, finance people just naturally are not
that way inclined.
Some people are. You get more people on the commercial side who are a bit more like that. But generally, the culture of finance is, you're risk adverse. You're going to get everything perfectly right. You're going to do and what we're saying here is actually it's okay to get some stuff wrong as long as it's, it's heading in the right direction. That's quite
it's a big shift.
It's quite a shift in a mindset that's really drummed into you from an early age.
Well, I'd like to build on that. That's so interesting that working with that specific person at ASOS sort of opened your mind to a different way of being and taught you so much. Have any of you sort of fostered that innovative mindset working with any CFOs, or, changed the way that they think about possibly being more agile? Or have you found it, to Helen's point, more of a challenge because actually they're process driven and they think differently?
So one of the things I was saying earlier on, back to reporting lines, right? So whilst I'm not a fan of that hierarchy, there is an advantage, whether it's the CFO, the COO, or the CSO, by the way, of being a member of that leadership team, because you get a lot of coaching from the CFO to their directs about how things work around here, and you get a lot of insights. And I completely echo the point you made of it. Finance people, I've learned, because I've worked in lots of finance functions and been in their leadership teams, are very structured, and for a good reason. They are managing the money on behalf of the organization and the risk associated with that, and therefore we used to talk about landing a P45 on a postage stamp, right? Because you have to get the numbers that accurately right before you expose them. So I have worked with finance teams and tried to drive some of that agility and RPA work, and a robot's going to do that work. That's not going to be right, because who's watching the robot and making sure that it's done right? Who wrote the program, and can I check the code? You get into all of that, inspection over inspection over inspection. So the key for me was around trust and credibility and doing small things. But also being able to relate to the work that they did and understanding where the problems were. I think you mentioned it earlier. If you talk to the people in finance, some of them don't want to be doing some of those things. And so if you can take away some of the pain that they're facing day in, day out, because they work long hours, closing the books every single month, and then every single quarter, and then year end, there's a lot of activity there that they don't actually want to do. That's not what they qualified to do. Some do enjoy it, and I know some do absolutely love it. The majority don't really want to be doing that. They'd much rather be doing some of the insights and the scenario envisaging and some of the more strategic things that the CFO is asking for, but they can't do. So solving that problem through Agile has been a chore. And I use stories and analogies. So if you're going to buy a painting and you want it ready-made, that's one thing. But if you're going to paint the Mona Lisa by numbers, paint the Mona Lisa by numbers. You know what it's going to look like, but you don't get it from the get-go. So trying to break their paradigm that it's all got to be perfect from the get-go and doing it in small amounts. And the most difficult one I found, by the way, was it's okay to fail. My experience is amongst all of the functions I've worked with, finance people don't like to fail. And the word fail itself isn't in the vocabulary.
It's more in the lexicon.
It suggests that they got it wrong. They got something wrong, right? And CFOs don't allow your finance people to get things wrong.
I think it depends what kind of organisation you're in. So I've worked in a big corporate, an energy organisation, and I've worked in a government-owned organisation, and now I work in a private equity-backed organisation. And my observations from all of those different types of companies are the CFOs and the finance team have got a different level of risk appetite and different level of agility, for sure. So where I work now, it's okay to fail. And because you're kind of failing forward, failing fast, everybody gets that if you're just running at something, something's going to happen. And that's okay as long as you're within your guardrails and that kind of stuff. Whereas in a government-owned organisation or a big corporate energy organisation, again, that's different. And so I kind of worked in the energy organisation where we were shifting the IT function to be more agile. And that was a big journey, I would say, for people to understand what does that mean, because you do your business planning over 5 years, 3 years, 1 year. You set your budgets over a year. You go in, you write an investment paper for a system, you implement the system, and then it goes into run. Whereas if you're in an agile world, in a DevOps world, your finance structures need to look differently. The way in which you fund those systems differently, because you're never going through a big implementation and then dropping off implementation. It's a run situation. So that, I think, for me, from a finance perspective, where I work now, totally get that. That's what we're in, DevOps world. Whereas I'd say in the previous two organisations, it definitely was an invest, run. I think when you can show them, actually, that's quite wasteful. And actually, if you can get into that DevOps world and keep your budgets at a more flat rate, it's much more appreciated, I think.
Okay, maybe we can open it up to a few questions, if there are any questions from the audience. Anyone want to? Yeah, gentleman at the front here, thank you. If you could just tell us your name and your organisation, please.
Mark Murray from Frontier Economics. My question, I have worked with CFOs of all different flavours over the years, and as a IT director, CIO, I have to evolve, and I am seeing an evolution of the CFO and what they were before and what they are now. And what I'm also have been told that it's better to work with the CEO as a direct report as opposed to the CFO if I want to get things done. I think that's changed now. Do you think, the CFOs on that panel, that dial has now changed enough so that actually we should be working with CFOs? That's one question. The second question is, do you think the CIO and the IT director types should be sitting at the same table, having the same conversation, making those decisions? Because it's not as common. A CFO will be on the board, but the IT director, CIO will not always be on the board.
Yeah. Just my view, I think that if I was a CTO, I would want to report into the CEO, not the CFO. With the best one in the world, CFOs just don't understand tech as well, but also you really need the CEO to have your back. You need a CEO that is really thinking about tech as part of the strategy and value creation. And I think having that voice around the executive table, I think is really powerful, particularly on any kind of business that's digital. I think that's super important. Should a CTO be on a PLC or a main board? I would really suggest that you try not to be, because it will suck your time. You will get very little back for doing it. And quite frankly, you probably speak about technology once a year in a strategy session, in which case go to that instead. Don't sit and listen to the finance team and the governance and the control and the risk management and don't do it.
Yeah, I align completely with you. For me, it's reporting into the CEO. Because you are part of setting strategy. Strategy, digital is part of strategy. Imagine any organisation today not having digital in its strategy. It would make no sense. I also agree with you on the board. And I think if you get NEDs in that have that technology experience, they're actually a really good a critical friend for you as a CIO. That's been my experience previously. So I would say no to the board, but have a NED with CIO or technical background.
Yeah.
In the spirit of giving a slightly different perspective, although I do agree with the principle, right? Back to your question. So reporting lines at one level almost irrelevant, but a seat at the table, I think, critical. A relationship with the CFO, and the COO and the head of sales and the regions is really important. So whilst we've focused on the CFO relationship to the CIO or the CTO, actually it's important, given the enterprise role of technology, to have a relationship with all of those CXOs. But regarding the board, I agree with you from a time perspective. It does depend on the nature of the business. If that particular business technology is a conversation that's going to come up at every board meeting, then there's a need for being in the board. I also agree with, don't waste your time going to the sessions that aren't about technology. But from a risk perspective, particularly at this moment in time where people aren't quite clear what to do with generative AI and the cyber risk associated with that, from a tech enablement perspective for growth strategy, if that's a topic that the board's going to be involved in on a regular basis, so for me, it's about being in the conversation when it's relevant rather than being in the chair, if you understand that distinction. You don't have to be reporting to the CEO if you're at the C-suite every time there's a conversation that's relevant to technology. And that's part of my lessons, which is when you're not in the room, that's calories being burnt. Because you're not in the room, the topic comes up, you then have to respond to it, which then goes back to the response, to the response, to the response. So you're always chasing at one level. Now, every company's different, so you're only hearing our individuals' perspectives.
I have a little bit of a thing on that. So for me, I am first and foremost a business leader with the peers in the room. We all happen to have technical capabilities that sit with us as well, but we're all business leaders leading the business. So I think being in the room when there isn't a technical conversation is also quite important. So I get really involved in safety conversations, ESG conversations, sales conversations, because, you know, I've got something to bring from other organisations as well. So I don't just rock up and talk about technology. So that's my kind of, I suppose, added contribution to that. I am a business leader first and foremost who happens to be a CIO, and I think my peers feel like that as well about theirs. So
I would say I was always like that as a CFO as well, and I think that is a shift that we're seeing around the C-suite. And certainly, you know, I'm a finance person by training, and I'm an audit chair on a board. But first and foremost, I am a board member, not an audit chair. So I'm not going there just to sit there and only talk about finance and audit, because why would I do that? I'd be dull. You know, you go because you're talking broader strategy. It just so happens that I'm the only idiot in the room that can do the audit stuff, and it gets dumped on me. But, you know, I think that there's definitely a trend in the C-suite that you have a functional expertise, but the days of sitting as a functional leader and only talking about your topic, I just think that is long gone now, because the silos have to move. It's so interconnected.
Yeah. Brandon, Mark, any thoughts on the question? Do you wanted to add anything there?
No, to be honest, I agree fully. I don't think I have.
The only thing I would note is that Gartner Research conducts an annual survey in which they ask this question: who do you report to? And then they look at the year-to-year change, and the stereotype is still very well entrenched that if the percentage of CIOs who are reporting to CFOs has gone down, it's the underlying tone of the survey is we're winning. Like, we're breaking through. If it goes in the other direction, that means, you know, like we're being marginalized again. Although I think, as you can tell from the panel, we all have our own specific experiences and different situations that make the actual reporting relationship somewhat immaterial.
But the CTO role, it can only get more prominent around the table. It can, you know, and I think that's a really exciting place to be.
Well, I think we'll end it on the CTO role can only get more powerful and move forward.
that's a great point.
Thank
to
you.
end
We're
on.
here.
Absolutely. Thank you all very much.